Good evening and welcome. So what are digital utilities? SingPass, those in Singapore. Login.gov, USA, for secure logins. PayNow, FedNow, for secure payments. MyInfo. So in Singapore, it stores digital records that can be shared, say, for an insurance application. Foundational services for end-user apps and services to operate. So there's technology there. There's also policy, trust and governance, government layers, rules and frameworks, cybersecurity, privacy and compliance. All this is the substrate. But can you imagine the innovation if you could use SingPass or PayNow even in the US and vice versa? This is just one of the potentials of broadening the substrate, opening up such digital utilities so more people can build apps and services to operate internationally. Just alone in APAC, estimates are the whole ecosystem around digital utilities will grow to an over $1 trillion market. With the right mix of tech and policy, it will grow, and here with us are some of the very players who are building the stuff across the full stack. So let's talk about how this stack can be best architected to drive innovation in the B2B, B2C space in apps and services, incorporating AI, how to build digital utilities that work for people. So Michael, you manage the common securitization platform handling $16 trillion in securities, its foundational infrastructure at massive scale. What are the top 3 architectural principles from that experience that governments today should apply when building digital utilities?
The first thing is really understand what your business problem is and be able to very clearly state what it is. Technology for technology's sake isn't that very interesting. So we're focused on making houses affordable, and for CSS, we had a $500 million a year cost reduction. There were lots of other benefits, but we just kept repeating those two. The second is understand the characteristics of the solution that you need to put into place. So the non-functionals of the thing. Remember a meeting where we had one of these new innovative technologies come in and they said, use our thing. It's like, okay. And how many transactions? Well, we can do 8,000 a day. It's like, no, I need 100,000 a second, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you need to understand the scale, how you're going to do all of these sorts of things. And then the last piece of this is all about how do you make sure that everything works together and interop and all of those sorts of pieces.
Very cool, Michael. Are there any gaps? What are the biggest gaps today in this?
I think the biggest gap is that when you design these things, they're likely to be there for a long time. At the end of the day, we were replacing systems that had been built 50 years earlier. And so you need to think about how do you Legos, when they first came out with their studs in the 1950s, they still interconnect with ones that are built today. And so you've got to design the governance model, the interconnection model, how does everybody work together? Because what you're building is likely to be there for a long term. So how do you operate it? How do you run it? How do you govern it? All those sorts of pieces need to be from the beginning.
Right. Code and infrastructure. So the NetTech Foundation, you were bridging, I said, capital pools and small businesses through open finance. Now, open finance is like when financial data can be securely and readily transferred by the customer to the financial institution of their choice. What funding models from financial infrastructure could accelerate digital utility deployment, especially in underserved markets?
I think the key is that there's a major chasm at the moment from the people who need the capital and the major capital pools that have them. And the major capital pools, they need places to put those capital. So how do you bridge that chasm between them? And we're talking about digital utilities, we're talking about trust, we're talking about communities and governance and co-ops and all of those sorts of pieces. And so you need to think about your trust level, your trust layer, your digital public good, and how that piece of revealing. Then you need to think about how do you value things, how do you underwrite things. He was talking about how do you make sure you know how to insure it, and all of the rules of those sorts of things, and then ultimately connect it into the markets that already exist speak their languages so you can connect across those bridges.
I think it's a great segue to ask Suchi. You've worked with underserved markets and with capital. You came up with the giant, is that Global Internet Access Network Token Protocol, built on blockchain to make bandwidth a currency, tokenizing bandwidth, so users share in the economic value they create. Can you explain how this giant protocol works in practice?
Sure, thank you, Mark. Hi, everyone. Let me start by asking a question to the audience. Does one of you all want to guess how much an average American spends just on mobile connectivity in their entire lifetime? Anyone? Just take a random guess.
40,000.
Close. So it's between $70,000 to $80,000 in their entire lifetime. That's about down payment for, in some of the places. So to me, the problem that we actually had noticed was that 80 to 90% people in the world have no access to building savings or wealth building products. But all of us collectively are already spending close to $690 billion on just mobile plans and mobile connectivity every single year. So the unique insight was, how can we meet people where they are? And connectivity being the largest utility on the planet, where 5.5 billion of us are already spending money on connectivity. So the idea was, how can we just take that existing spend and turn that into an income generating asset, which means so in the US, we are spending about, as an individual, not families, as an individual, $1,000 annually. Now let's just take $250 of that, and if that $250 was kept aside, auto-deposited, and earned 15% annually, compounded over your lifetime, which is about 60 years is what we are talking about, that becomes $7 million. So from the existing spend, it can now help people and communities actually build real savings and wealth. That's basically Giant's mission. It's to actually create an asset class such that every single person on the planet can now become an owner and actually benefit from that spend that they're already making. And connectivity being the largest utility, that is why we started with connectivity.
Wow. So now I'm wondering how much people spend over their lifetime now on OpenAI or Claude subscriptions?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So are there similarities to, could this model apply to other digital utilities? Like
I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you asked. So of course, when we dug into this problem, we did realize that our spend on utilities and digital utilities is only going to grow, and it is in fact one of the largest spends. So yes, with Giant Protocol, we can actually turn any utility into becoming an asset class. Now, easier said than done, okay? So it's a very deep tech play in terms of how do you do this in the right way. We're not talking about the speculative, cryptocurrencies that are out there. We're really talking about building an asset class that is sustainable, that is community owned, compliant, and also global. So from that standpoint, we in fact recently signed an MOU with, it's confidential, so can't go into the details, but the idea was to take a totally different asset, a totally different utility, and in fact apply Giant Protocol to supporting that. And that alone would allow, it would be several billions of dollars in value that alone would generate in the coming years. So certainly, it started from, so connectivity is still the largest utility on the planet for which would enable pretty much anybody now for the first time ever to actually own an asset class. But that said, yes, it is applicable to every utility out there.
Right. So owning an asset class, making it like a foundation for people to participate in the economy. Digital utilities can be one of those. Now, since you've had experience building Giant across diverse markets, right? What are the biggest misconceptions you've found amongst governments about democratizing digital utility access?
So first and foremost, governments have done an incredible job in making connectivity access become possible, right? That is the reason why we have 5.5 billion people already having access to connectivity. The misconception, though, is governments thinking that that's enough. That just by having access, it can now bring about this socio-economic mobility, right? To me, that's where I see the gap, where it's like, yes, access is table stakes, right? You have to start from there, but that's not enough. And that's where, to me, economic participation, in fact, comes into play, where one of the areas where governments could, in fact, be more proactive would be, now, how do we actually take this to the next level, where we can bring that economic participation so it can actually help with driving social and economic mobility as well. That's one. Second, I would say, is that this belief that a utility has to be entirely centralized. And that's where has to be centralized from the standpoint of reliability, right? So of course, that's because that's been how traditionally they have worked, right? And largely that was true, but now thanks to the technologies that we have with us, that no longer is true. There can be hybrid models, and of course in Giant's case, we are a hybrid play such that it's not completely decentralized and it's also not entirely centralized, but it's a mixture of both. It's a hybrid play. And so that was another one. So those were the two misconceptions, I would say. But there are, governments are doing a lot in terms of from their side. It's more about now just welcoming and adopting the newer models that have for the first time become possible.
Singapore, I think of it as reliable and, to some degree, centralized. And Suchi talked about decentralization. Now, we know Singapore has built digital utilities such as e-invoice, TradeTrust, SG Trade Dex. What's the strategic thinking behind choosing these? And maybe you can add whether they work better centralized or decentralized.
Okay, maybe just a quick clarification. The e-invoicing is not built by the Singapore government. We actually adopt an international network. So maybe that give me a good entry point. Singapore think of the whole Singapore digital utility stack around the life or digital economy. I think Singapore is a country and economy is important to us. So when we start thinking about the digital utility, we think of, okay, what do you need? In a physical world, when you do trade, it's very easy, right? I meet up with you, I shake hands with you, we sign a contract, I hand you the money, you give me the goods, and maybe we exchange some documents. Easy. Maybe easy is the wrong word. We have been using trade for so many years like that, no problem. But in the digital world, how do you do it? If I don't even see you, how do I know that you are who you are? That's why digital utility of digital identity is important to us. So SingPass we come out with that about many years back, and that was centralized protocol. Now we think, okay, now I know who you are. How do I make payment to you? How do I invoice you? That's when PayNow, that's when e-invoicing come about. PayNow we actually built from scratch, but invoicing, we did not. We actually look around the world and realized that maybe around the world, someone had did something very well, so we try to learn from it. And bringing me to the point, when we think of digital utility, interoperability with the rest of the world is actually very, very important to us. No point doing a digital utility that can be used in Singapore. Singapore, I mean, as my DC said earlier, Singapore have a population of 5-6 million, maybe thereabout. If we create a digital utility that can be used in Singapore and unable to interoperate with the rest of the world, it does not make sense. And I mentioned earlier, trade is important to us. So now after you're able to identify yourself, you're able to pay someone, you're able to invoice someone, then how do you make sure there's a way to exchange documents? How is there a way to make sure that exchange data? That's why I call it data exchange. Actually, TradeTrust, Singapore Trade Data Exchange is a company, but also a system to try to exchange trade data with one another. We are a system that are able to exchange data. Now next, how do you assure that the data that will pass along the way? For example, the manufacturing pass something to a supplier pass something to a buyer, along with a document get exchanged with many people. How do you know the document that end up in your mailbox or end up whatever you have is actually original? Nobody actually make any changes to it. That's why we come out with document attestations. So when we think of the whole Singapore digital utility stack, we think of it as a whole system around economic development. I think that's an important point. The second point is we don't create everything ourselves. If there's something in the whole world that makes sense, we adopt it. We may customize it because of Singapore's unique situation, but we will adopt it. So I think that's important. So although currently Singapore government funded, maybe run some of the digital utility in Singapore, but we are actually of the opinion that Singapore government may not need to run it forever. I think the main difference between public utility in the physical world and the digital utility in the digital world is that digital utility in the digital world have a much bigger outreach. For example, roads I built in Singapore, you have to come to Singapore to use my road, right? For lack of better words. But a digital utility that someone make in the world, it can be used by anyone in the world. I mean, one prime example is I don't use Singapore. For example, payment system that the Chinese use a lot, Alipay, WeChat Pay that they use a lot. It's actually very, very popular now. I mean, in most countries, you can even use it. So as Chinese citizens travel the world, they actually know to use a local payment system. That is a food for thought for a lot of countries. So we are, although we start the utility, we adopt the utility, but we are of the opinion that we may not need to run the utility forever because of the reach of the digital utility. Private sector may decide to come in, and we welcome private player to play in that space as well.
How do you decide when that goes from government back to private sector?
I think okay, that's my view. I think there are two parts to consider. One, the trust. The trust layer actually is very, very important. For example, digital utility. How do you ensure that digital utility continue to have the trust of not only your citizen, but as you do business with the rest of the world? So certain utility like digital identity may be something that government may want to hold on to it a bit closer. Things like data exchange, things like document attestations, things like maybe digital payment. Well, I think that's something that maybe the private player.
So it might be easier for SingPass to be within Singapore, but the invoice, the
payment side of the house. I think currently we do have a lot of payment system that's privately run. Yeah. So I think that's something we think of. Yeah.
Yeah. So I assume because you're developing in Singapore, and Singapore is maybe not exactly a very big country. What about scaling this across the world or even Asia? Like what have you learned in doing this such that even though it's developed for Singapore, you think about how it can be scaled across Asia?
That's an interesting question. So for example, TradeTrust, I'm not sure how many are familiar with it. TradeTrust basically leverage on blockchain to ensure the authenticity of documents. We actually open source it. So we actually put the code up into the GitHub, we open source it, we actually allow anyone to use it, allow anyone to make changes to it. I think that brings back the fundamental thinking in Singapore. Digital utility must be interoperable with the rest of the world. There's few ways to do it, right? One way is to, force everybody to use it. That's not practical, right, for Singapore, small country. The other way is to open it up, free for everybody to use it. Now that may work because free things, sounds good, right? People use it, people adopt it, and people find it useful, we'll continue to use it. Of course, one or the other, the third way is try to open source it at the same time, try to bring it to international standards. Try to plug into the international standard, try to convince people that, maybe this can become international standard. But we are also very realistic. If the product we make is not good enough, if someone make a better product and they are better product to make it to international standard, we are more than happy to look at it, more than to adopt it. I think fundamentally, interoperability is important in the digital utility space. And as the world becomes smaller, digitally speaking, interoperability of different utility is actually key to all of us, I think.
How do you see emerging models, like what Suchi posed in tokenization, when it comes to incorporating this while maintaining the interoperability, the reliability that's required?
I don't think they conflict with each other. I think tokenization is referring to distributing certain trust or distributing maybe certain layer or way of doing things. I don't think there's a problem. It depends on what problem you are trying to solve. For example, if you need something high assurance for financial purposes, etc., then maybe a more centralized, a more single authority model makes sense. But you're talking about maybe not a lot of things need account assurance, right? I mean, a lot of things you do in everyday life, you don't need to have 100% assurance on certain things. And for that kind of tokenizations, able to distribute throughout the whole rest of the world makes sense. So this is how I think of it.
Wow. So anyone, maybe in summary, if you were designing a new digital utility from scratch today, obviously scaling, serving millions, maintaining the foundational reliability, equitable access, and of course being financially sustainable, what would be your non-negotiables? Or where would you compromise? Anyone?
I can start with 2. 1, global from day 1.
Okay.
Absolute must. Because now we are living in a digital world, right? So how do we actually create digital utilities such that they can be accessible globally versus being nationally? Easier said than done, but that would be something if we make it part of our foundational design that can be done. Second, community owned. In terms of how do we make sure that that us as citizens, individuals, are not just actually using services, but are also active participants and also able to get value out of it. So those would be my 2 non-negotiables. Of course, I'm biased a little bit, but.
So I would extend the community to human-centric. At the end of the day, we need to solve problems that matter to us and that we can live with the solutions and that enhance our community. And then a second one is when we build these things, they need to operate for a long time. We talked about the challenges that there are in terms of regulating. So you have to build in the instrumentation so that we can understand what it's doing, so that we can then make decisions and deal with all of the unexpected consequences. And so how are we going to operate it, govern it, all of those sorts of things?
I think my first interoperable, that's very similar to hers, the global. I think that's actually key for digital utility. And maybe the next one is trust anchor or trust level. I don't think, I'm not meant to say that government must do it, but there might be some form of trust anchor. It can be at different level, can be community level, can be government level, can be association level, it doesn't matter. It's really a matter of for someone who wants to use the digital utility, who do they trust? I think that's important for it to be able to function.
Yeah. Well, this could be a continuous, exciting discussion, but I think in the interest of time, we will kind of wrap up. Maybe for each of you, as we close, what gives you the most hope about the future of digital utilities? And what concerns do you have, or what excites you the most about digital utilities?
I think that in terms of concerns is that we have an opportunity to redo a lot of fundamental things. And the internet got us to do, and we skipped paying attention to a lot of things like security and all of those sorts of things. So the biggest concern I have is if we don't think about the characteristics of the solution we want, we're going to miss some of those pieces. But I think the fact that we're having these kinds of conversations and the governance and the AI is what gives me optimism that we're actually going to design these systems with those characteristics from the beginning so that as they evolve, they'll meet our requirements.
So for me, I think it's very interesting. It's maybe 2 sides of the same thing. First, the concern is for certain digital utility, I think it's become very, very regionalizations, become very, very national point of view. I think that's a concern. I mean, for a small country like Singapore, for example. And then, of course, what gives me hope is we do see small pocket of community getting together to standardize standards, to look at how do we do things together. I think that gives me hope that actually digital utility may be a way to function, like internet, hopefully, in the future.
Yeah, thanks.
So I would like to quote Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate economist. He would talk about, at a fundamental humanitarian level, there are 2 things that matter the most. One is human freedom, and second is economic freedom. And for the large part, human freedom is, economic freedom is actually a prerequisite for human freedom. So to me, the greatest challenge that all of us collectively can in fact solve is how do we enable economic freedom for all of us from where they are, right? And so to me, the future of digital utilities should be such that it's not just access driven, but it's also driven by shared ownership and us collectively not just contributing to it, but then also getting value back. So let's build digital utilities that actually build savings and wealth for all of us.
So with that, may I just thank all my panelists, Michael McFarland, Suchi Suresh, Eng Soon for an amazing panel discussion on the new stack, digital utilities as innovation substrate. Hope this foments many more amazing discussions later to come tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark.
Hey, thanks.